Hello, I'm Robert, a voluntary fact check and helping you if you're scared. And this is about, we've had another couple of clickbait stories which claim that Putin is going to use nukes against NATO, and this is it would be utterly insane of him. Totally crazy, not just crazy in the way he's been so far, not less ruthless and rational, but he would be insane like someone who tries to walk out of a 10-story building thinking everything is fine, or someone who thinks that Russia is being attacked by giant spiders. It's that level of insanity he would need to try to attack NATO. And even if he was as insane as that, his generals would refuse, because it'd be utterly mad. They would claim to have problems with the line, not being able to talk to the people they're supposed to. They'd find any reason they could, and then kind of signalling to others to try and get a straitjacket or something. They'd be doing everything they could to stop him, because it would be literal insanity, and there's nothing to suggest that he's insane. And what he is a good bluffer and he's very good at manipulating language, and his aim is to try to scare you. That's what he's trying to do, and he's very successful at that. He's very good at words. He's very good at using words and vague hints to scare the ordinary people in democracies, because he knows that if the ordinary democracies are scared, if the ordinary people get scared, then they pressurize the governments, and then the governments can be persuaded to not provide Ukraine with the best weapons. Because even fighting Ukraine with the second best weapons of NATO, Russia is losing. He'd lose Russia, the war overnight if Ukraine had the best weapons that NATO has to offer. And so he's absolutely desperate not to let NATO, and there's nothing he can do to stop them except continually bluff. And then NATO knows he's not going to really attack with nukes, so he's got to try to scare people. And that's why he does it. And that's the only reason he does it. Plus, to try and get kudos with his own people. He doesn't want a war. So, look, here's an example. He wants a good future for himself, his children, his grandchildren. His generals want a good future. Nobody wants a world war. That's very stupid. And just crazy. He cares about, he's not communist. He is a Christian oligarch. He fancies himself as being a modern Tsar. And he cares about Russia and Russian culture and buildings and artifacts and Russianness. He is very proud of the Fabergé eggs that belong to the former Tsar, and the museum of Fabergé eggs. And that's not going to do very well in a world war, is it? So why would he want a world war? If he wanted to live in a nuclear bunker, it'd be very easy. He's got the wealth. He'd easily buy a nuclear bunker and go and live there for the rest of his life, if that was his ambition. But as we'll see, he couldn't even do that if he won a world war, because if he tried to fight a world war, because he couldn't win it. He'd lose very, very quickly. As Michael Gove said, he doesn't think it's helpful to think of Putin as mad. I think we need to think of him as and indeed recognise as someone whose ruthlessness takes him into a moral sphere that the rest of us would find almost impossible to conceive of. So I get many people who say, well, we can't understand Putin, he's mad, he can do anything, he's going to use nukes against NATO because he's crazy. But that is not a good, helpful way to think of him. Helpful way of thinking of him is as rational but ruthless. And from that point of view, it makes utterly no sense, because and he's not going to do it, because it would be destroy his career, his regime, everything he values, and end up with him trying to escape justice in a foxhole, a tiny like Saddam Hussein, because his own people would be against him, and devastating for everyone who cares for him. And so I want to talk a little bit now about how you can look at the rest of this. So then I'll go back and talk about how weak Russia is now, and how using a nuke he couldn't destroy all of the conventional military, and he couldn't destroy. But let's just go backwards. So first of all, Putin tries to convey this idea that he could destroy the entire of Europe, the entire of the. This map may look scary, but it's not. So I will explain. And there's no way he's going to do this. Hypothetical, impossible scenario, and I will explain why he won't do it. But he tries to create the impression that he could literally make the rest of the NATO, all of NATO, into a wasteland, an uninhabitable place, and get rid of its population, just so there's nothing left at Russia, by first use of nukes. And then then people say, oh, if he was crazy enough, and then he wouldn't mind too much about what happens to Russia, because at least he's won. But he wouldn't win. He'd lose the war. He couldn't make the United States uninhabitable. Nobody can. Even if everyone, with all nukes in the world, even if the United States joined in, and they all fired nukes at the United States, it still wouldn't make it uninhabitable. Even if the United States fired all its nukes, and Russia, and China, and India, and Israel, and Pakistan, everyone in the world were to fire all their nukes at the United States, impossible hypothetical scenario, it would still be a very habitable country. So I've shown the hypothetical impossible scenario, and what we want to look at is how much of the United States is not in fallout plumes, and that's the entire Russian nuclear arsenal fired just at the United States, not any of the rest of NATO. And as you can see, most of the farmland is not going to have fallout, and most of the populated areas, not the cities. This is attacking the military establishments in the big cities, and still a lot of the cities are not going to have fallout. There's going to be people who are not living in the, and if you're living in the fallout plumes, then if you know what to do, then if you stay indoors and keep well away from the dust, and it's not dust in the atmosphere, it's dust that's fallen on the ground, you can see the dust, you can watch it fall out of the sky. If you keep well away from that dust, that's the radioactive stuff, and stay indoors and stay as well away from the walls, add extra protection, add boxes of books and boxes of clothes and anything you've got to pile up as much stuff between you and the dust on the outside the walls, then you'll greatly reduce any risk of radiation sickness. You're not going to die. And then once, after a couple of days, you can walk out of the fallout plume, which is no longer going to be very radioactive at all, to wherever the nearest ground is that isn't fallout. And you will have internet, and the cell phones will work for the first few hours because they've got battery backup. And you mightn't necessarily have internet, but you'd have the emergency workers coming quite soon. I mean, as you can see, there are going to be lots of hospitals and lots of doctors who are still who survived the nuclear explosion, so they'll be working together. Some of those will be equipped enough to come with hazmat suits, and they could come within hours. And the rest of the world, you've got 7.5 billion people not affected. They're going to be doing an emergency big rescue mission to help. It's nothing like Thread. Thread is just fictional. Even at the time, it was totally fictional. So there's no way that Putin can make the rest of Europe uninhabitable, and then, as NATO has said, and it's very obvious, it hasn't got enough nukes to stop the NATO conventional military. It hasn't got even one nuke for every NATO base and every UK base. If you add up the number of bases and you add up the number of nukes that Putin has, then he hasn't got enough to send one to each base. And never mind the fighters, never mind the destroyers, never mind the submarines. So there's no way he can destroy the conventional military, there's no way he can make countries uninhabitable, there's no way he can destroy the population. With this hypothetical attack, he kills 185 million. That's a bit over half of the population of the United States. This is not going to happen. This is just to show to you why Putin will not use nukes. Maybe I should put a big thing there, why Putin will not use nukes. No matter how ruthless he was, no matter how willing he was, and he hasn't done firebombing of Ukraine, which he could have done if he was that ruthless. Firebombing, starting fires deliberately across the city in order to defeat the city. Putin hasn't done that. So he has a limit, even though he's ruthless, he has a limit to it. That he either is not willing to stomach himself, or he doesn't think the Russian people would stomach. So now, if we go and look at the Russian, the US capability and the NATO capability, then if we look at the F-35s, then Russia doesn't have anything equivalent to the F-35. The F-35 is a jet that was built from the bottom up in order to be a stealth plane It's built of composite in materials, and it's designed so you can hardly see it with radar. Very carefully designed so that radar can't see it. And this is the advantage that it of course can find via anti-radar missiles. And this is the advantage that it can see the Russian fighter jets before the fighter jets can see it. It can see the Russian radar before the radar can see it. So if with a few dozen F-35s, then NATO could fly over Ukraine, and this is an F-35 test pilot who was Billy Flynn, who was interviewed by Aviation Today in April, and he says that in a parallel world it's not going to happen. There's no way that NATO is going to give F-35s, send F-35s to Ukraine, but to show how outmatched Russia is, then if they were to send F-35, it would just fly over Ukraine, over the occupied areas that Russia is occupying. It would shoot down any of the Russian fighter jets that would try to go against it before they could even see it, and be firing missiles before the fighter jet can see it. The missiles would have left, and the F-35 would be on to its next target before the fighter jet can see it. It would attack the radar on the ground before the ground radar can see it, and soon there would be no air-to-ground, ground-to-air assets left for Russia, and no air assets left. It would completely destroy the Russian aviation, and then it would start attacking the Russian forces from the ground. I mean, within a day, there'd be nothing Russia could do except withdraw from Ukraine. So that's how much better NATO is. And Russia has tried to build a fifth generation fighter jet like the F-35, and I have a section about this if I can find it, yes, called the Su-57, but it had many technical problems and crashes. Their frame just broke apart during an attempt to display how it was working. They claim to have used a couple to hit targets deep in Ukraine early in the war, but they clearly haven't used it since then, if that was a correct claim. And they're clearly not combat ready. And the problem for Russia is the cost. It cost $400 billion for the United States to develop the F-35. Russia just doesn't have that kind of money. And Russia was trying to develop the fighter jet by getting contracts from foreign countries, and it hoped to be able to develop 300 later this decade. But they've all shied away. They're going to find it very difficult to sell them now because of the Ukraine war and the effect it's had on Russia's reputation. Nobody wants to be associated with it. So probably Russia won't even have a fighter jet like the F-35 even by the end of this decade, because it just can't find buyers for the Su-57, so it can't find the funding to develop it far enough to be usable in combat. Whereas the F-35, it's a fantastic plane. It's also got amazing night flying. It can, at the minimum I should enter combat by having seen my adversary long before he could see me. And he's got this system that lets them see with infrared cameras, and the entire plane becomes invisible. And he uses it mainly at night. It's not much use in the daytime because it's got such excellent visibility. It's very good for seeing outside anyway with outside. But at night, he says I can see a moon, and all of a sudden I see with perfect orientation the moon, mountains, highways, electrical power lines, rivers, and lakes. So at night he can it's got a tremendous advantage over other planes. And then he says that with F-35 that it was designed for something like the Ukraine war. So we go in and kill every surface-to-air missile threat that was out there, neutralize all the threats on the ground, and achieve air dominance, because we kill all the air-to-air assets also. And he compares it like playing a game of football with one of the teams completely invisible. Then it'd be very easy to win at the World Cup if your team was invisible. And that's the situation that that NATO would be in if it was ever in a fight against Russia. And meanwhile, Russian air defences have also been utterly hopeless. Ukraine sent a modified drone, a decades-old modified drone, and they managed to get all the way to Engels Air Force, hundreds of kilometers inside Russia, and significantly damage a fighter jet. And that's must be one of the best protected areas of the entire Russia against air defences, best air defences, best they can manage. And then we saw this also with the attack with the GLMRS, the HIMARS, that when they attacked the Antonovsky Bridge at Kherson, then for a while the Russians had their best air defences on that bridge to try and protect it. And we saw the effects. You got the explosion on the bridge, and then a bit later you got a whole lot of explosions in the air, and explosions in the air were the S-400 firing back at the ATACMS, at the HIMARS. So Russia couldn't hit it. And the reason was that most ballistic missiles go like that, and the S-400s are designed to look for missiles that are pushing from an angle like that and work out how fast they're moving, and they don't change course after they've been fired, or hardly at all. And the S-400s was designed for that. Well, the HIMARS, GLMRS, they go right up to close to the edge of space. They go flying along, and then they do a sudden right angle turn directly above the target, and they accelerate down at hypersonic speeds and much faster than the speed of sound, so they hit before you can hear them. And it seems, even though that was invented in the 1990s, and it was tested in the 1990s, there's lots of this video of it, and Russia knew what it did, but it seems the S-400 has not been designed to be able to counter something that does that. They just don't have a clue. The system doesn't know what to do. And it fires just randomly at an angle, and it doesn't try to look for something coming from vertically above. And they just can't stop it. And so Russia is just completely defenseless against NATO weapons. And in the Ukraine war, we've seen this with HIMARS. They can't stop HIMARS, so we had lots of very spectacular explosions, like a fireworks factory, explosion in a fireworks factory, with explosions of the munitions dumps, and that went on for quite a long time. And even though Russia knew that HIMARS was coming, they never did anything about their munitions dumps. They just left them where they were, and continued supplying them. And HIMARS came along and exploded them all. This is an example of how inflexible the Russian command is. They had weeks of notice that Ukraine was going to get HIMARS, and yet they didn't do anything to try to protect their munitions dumps, and a lot of them exploded. And now they no longer accumulate munitions. Now they have the command posts. The Russian strategy is designed around the range of the HIMARS. So they keep their important command posts. They have their munitions, also their fuel dumps, and everything is 85 kilometers away from the front line, because if they go any closer, they'll be destroyed by HIMARS. And the whole strategy has been designed around that limit of 85 kilometers. Well, NATO has ATACMS, which is the same as HIMARS, but it can go 300 kilometers, and it's much more powerful. And there's a minority think that the Kerch Bridge was destroyed by ATACMS, and majority seem to think it was a truck bomb, but whatever it is, it gives an idea of what ATACMS could do. They could do something like the disruption that happened to the Kerch Bridge. That's what ATACMS could do. And Putin, with his bluffs, has managed to persuade NATO not to supply Ukraine with ATACMS. And the generals know that he's not going to go use nukes, but it would be just too unpopular with the general public, so that's Putin is scaring you deliberately in order to try to get you to influence the governments, so the governments don't supply Ukraine with ATACMS and with all the other things that they could supply Ukraine with, which would let it win the war much faster. And Professor Boris Johnson, Prime Minister, and he used to be the one thing that he had many failings, but the one thing that he really understood well was the military strategy and the capabilities of Russia and Ukraine. And he says that the Western governments should supply Ukraine with everything that it needs and wants and that it can use, so they can win the war faster, because it's the only way it's going to end. Because especially since annexing those new regions, Russia's made the situation, it's just impossible to negotiate with it anymore. And the only way that Ukraine can win can reach peace is by ending this war, by defeating Russia. And so these are some things that haven't yet been supplied. So they've got the Sting and the Starstreak and the Javelin. They haven't supplied, and the harms to destroy, which they use to destroy radar. So the M77s. So they have these like howitzers. They're like shells, but they so I'll talk about that in a minute. This is about the planes. Then they haven't supplied the ATACMS, as I was talking about. They haven't supplied Storm Shadow stealth cruise missiles. They're almost radar invisible, like the F-35s, or even the veteran Tomahawk cruise missile. And they don't have that. That's a range of 1,000 miles or something. They were going to supply the Grey Eagle drones. It's been held up for months. They F-16 jets, which are much better than MiG-29s and far better than I think all the Russian jets, and the Ukrainians could learn to fly them quickly, and they've also got lots of spare MiG-29s, and Putin has managed to persuade them not to supply these to Ukraine either, and by bluffing about nukes. So that's why Putin bluffs. He's doing it to stop NATO from supplying these things, because he knows that Russia would lose very, very quickly if NATO was to supply if NATO was to supply the F-16 jets and some cruise missiles and ATACMS, then that would be the end. And the Leopard jets, the tanks, and a few tanks, and some armoured infantry fighting vehicles, then the war would be over very, very quickly. And that would just be the end of the Ukraine invasion. And then it's going to end anyway. It's not going to keep going for endlessly, because this is an estimate that Russia can make maybe 1.6 to 1.7 million shells a year, and it uses about 14 million shells a year. So it can only supply about 1 month's worth of shells, a bit over a month's worth of shells in a year, about a tenth of the shells that it actually uses, it can supply. And so it's going to run out of shells. The reason Russia has so many shells is because it used to be the former Soviet Union. So it included Ukraine, of course, and it included the Czechoslovakia, it included the Baltic states, many countries, and it had all the economy of all those countries, and it used those to make these millions and millions of shells, and it's using them all up, and it can't make them again, because it doesn't have the economic capability to make all the shells that it's using up. And so when it runs out, it'll only be able to fire a tenth of the shells it's firing today. And so it won't be able to keep the war up. It might keep it up. It would then have to choose. Is it going to use its 1.6 to 1.7 million shells for 1 month more fighting, and then it's completely used up? Or is it going to reduce it to a tenth of the shells that it normally uses, and then it would lose very quickly? So there's no way. It's going to run out of shells sometime next year. It can't keep going through to 2024. It might even be running out already, we don't know. And it's certainly not going to be able to keep going next year. And this is where I want to talk about the M77s. So the M77 has a range of 25 kilometers, and that's the same as the Russian shells, but it's far more precise. The M77 and the GLMRS and the HARM anti-radar, they all got an order of a few meters or better. They're GPS guided. They use the center of the GPS coordinates, so that you just basically got a photograph or map of where the things you want to hit. You just put it in the coordinates into the missile, and it will just hit it. Whereas the Russians don't have that. They have inertial guidance, which means that you've got to key in where it starts from and end coordinates. The guidance isn't as accurate as GPS anyway. Even if you got those 100% correct, it would still, over long distance, be out by tens of meters. And the further you have to fire it, the more error-prone the inertial guidance is, because it's got a certain amount of error depending on how far it's been flying. And it's very easy to make a mistake in typing the wrong coordinates. Indeed, there's one video where it seems that the operators typed in the launch point twice, and so they hit themselves. There's a video of this shell, of this guided missile from Russia, and it flies up into the air, it turns around and it goes back and hits precisely where it was fired from. So a GPS guided missile couldn't do that. Some operator just typed in their own coordinates twice by mistake. They must have had lots of coordinates to type in. So that's what Russia's using, and it's not nearly as good for its long-distance missiles, and it's nearly out of long-distance missiles. They, at the rate of 100 a day, they couldn't keep up a week with what they got left of their long-distance precision cruise missiles. And that's why they had to rely on the Iran, and Iran won't have enough to keep them up for long. So they're not going to be able to win like that. And then the harm, that was the most very important in this war, not much publicity about it. The Russians have no defense against any of these things, and the harm is destroys the Russian radar systems as soon as they switch it on. And the M77s, they used to have to stop, and they used to have to fire and then immediately start moving, and luckily they're able to move very quickly. They're designed so you can fire and forget and then drive away before the Russian even knows where it's being fired from. But the Russians were able to use their radar to fire back to exactly where the M77s were firing from, so they had to keep moving. But now with harm, and these are fired from the Ukrainian jets, it's now impossible for Russia to do that. If they switch on the radar to try and detect where the M77s are, then they will immediately be destroyed. The radar system will be destroyed, the anti-ballistic radar system will be destroyed. So now the M777s, they now just stay in the same place for a couple of days on end, because they know the Russians can't find them. They don't have to keep moving anymore. And so the mainstream media, for some reason, just don't tell you about these things. And then but the experts I do follow, generals and military experts tell you about this. And then the NATO tanks are vastly superior too. The Abrams tanks are far, far better than the Russian tanks. If you had a dozen Abrams tanks and 1,000 Russian tanks, the Abrams tanks would just be able to drive right up to them and destroy them all, and the Russians wouldn't be able to do anything to the Abrams tanks. They're that good. But the US doesn't want to export them to Ukraine because they want to keep the technology secret. And particularly this depleted uranium after you remove the stuff that is used for making nuclear bombs. So that is very unradioactive uranium. Uranium is very, very dense. And so this apparently is very good for protecting tanks. And they don't want the Russians to learn how good it is. So they're keeping the technology secret. And so they don't want to export them to Ukraine. But if there ever was a war involving NATO and Russia, then the Russians wouldn't be able to stop the NATO tanks. They couldn't do anything about them. And so now let's look at this thing. And Russia's going to run out of shells eventually, and Avril, the chief of Avril Haines, the Deputy of US National Intelligence, confirmed what everyone else says, that the Russians are using up their shells, far faster than they can make them, and eventually they're going to run out. So there's no way this war is going to end with Russia losing. There's no doubt about that. And Putin is just his bluffs so often because he's trying to reduce NATO support for Ukraine. The only way that Russia could lose is if NATO was to completely stop supplying Ukraine with its missiles, because Ukraine can't make enough missiles for its M77s and the other things it has. It has a military industry too, but it doesn't have enough to compete with the Russians with all the missiles that they still have left over from the Soviet Union. So, but NATO does. NATO easily can. We've got a huge defence industry, and NATO can easily supply, especially since their weapons are far more precise than the Russian ones. So NATO's ideal would be for NATO, Putin's ideal would be for NATO to stop supplying Ukraine with its munitions. And then if it did that, then there would be a chance of Russia winning. But there's no way NATO is going to do that. And then, now we come to the nukes. If Putin used even one small nuke in Ukraine, the US would likely sink many or all the ships in his Black Sea fleet. And they wouldn't do them with big Russian clouds. It wouldn't be like a MAD. That's no longer in the way they're thinking anymore. They would just be able to use the ATACMS, small half-ton explosives, and they just make neat holes in each ship, and they'd all start sinking, and without any fuss, very quietly. They wouldn't even explode. They would just all start sinking. And this may seem escalatory, but it isn't. So, United States has told Putin privately that if Putin uses even a single tactical nuke against Ukraine, then they've told him privately, and we don't know what exactly they said to, but General Milley said that amongst other things, they could hit targets in the Black Sea and in southern Ukraine, and the only target, obviously, in the Black Sea is the Black Sea Fleet, and be well within the US capabilities, they could do that. They could just send a few invisible F-35s, and they would all fire cruise missiles, invisible Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and just sink some of the this is something that Ukraine has already done with its Neptune, with the Moskva, which is sunk just using 2 Neptune drones that are Ukraine made. Its own domestic drones, and it used those to sink the Moskva. And so Putin doesn't expect NATO to attack Russia. If he was preparing for a world war, he wouldn't have invaded Ukraine at all, because Ukraine was not threatening Russia in any way. There was small localized shelling going on in the contact line in Donbass, and from time to time it would flare up a bit. They were just firing shells at a distance. And he can't go back to a stalemate like that either, because Ukraine is far more capable than it was on the 24th of February. It now has HIMARS. They didn't have HIMARS back then. And so they were just shelling back and forth and having ceasefires, and then sometimes shelling. And on 23rd, I think it was, Putin annexed the eastern part of Donbass. But no, he didn't annex. He declared they were independent. He recognized them as independent countries. And this tore up the Minsk agreement, and then he invaded Ukraine. And that was the complete end of the Minsk agreement. The Minsk agreement was helping Russia, was protecting Russia, and he also had the possibility. He was offered at the time that an agreement where both Russia and NATO would agree to not do large-scale exercises near the borders, and they would both stop all remove intermediate nuclear weapons, and they had a verification method they'd worked out and everything that was much better than our INF treaty. Putin could have signed that. If he was worried about NATO, he'd have signed that. He clearly isn't worried about NATO. He just wanted to take over Ukraine. He needs an excuse. And if he really worried about NATO, then he moved 20,000 odd soldiers from the Russian border with Norway, Finland, Estonia and Latvia, and protecting a small enclave of Kaliningrad. They've only got 6,000 soldiers left. That's just over 1,000 per country, including Kaliningrad. The border of Norway, he could have 1,000 for each of those countries, 1,000 for Norway, 1,000 for Finland, 1,000 for Estonia, 1,000 for Latvia, and 1,000 to protect Kaliningrad. I don't know how it's actually spread out, but he only has 6,000 for that entire area, soldiers left. And NATO's rapid response force is 300,000. Russia doesn't have a rapid response force. Russia sent all its capabilities into Ukraine. There aren't a million Soviet soldiers from the Soviet era in time machines waiting to pop out and attack Ukraine. This is it. And Russia is losing. And we see this most clearly with Bakhmut. It's a small city, so until HIMARS, Russia was advancing slowly using lots and lots of shells. Since HIMARS, they can't advance at all. And they sometimes take a position. They haven't even been doing that recently, hardly at all. Small handful of few houses. And the entire Russian soldiers, military, plus the entire Russian aviation, and everything they've got, and all their missiles, they can't take a small city called Bakhmut, which in peacetime is 70,000 people. And they've been trying to take this as their top priority target since early August. Nobody knows why. It's of no strategic significance. And even while we're losing half their tanks, nearly 1,000 tanks, the best tanks that are supposed to defend Moscow in the Battle of Izium, and just 50 kilometers away or something, just a few tens of kilometers away, they were still doing dozens of attacks a day, dozens attacks a day on Bakhmut, while their colleagues just a little bit down the road were losing 1,000 tanks. And they didn't send any reinforcements to help them. They're not coordinated. Russia is just a whole lot of uncoordinated groups of people doing their own thing and not helping each other. And the planes and the fighter jets don't coordinate with each other, and the fighter jets don't coordinate with the ground, and people need help because the soldiers need help at the front line, and the helicopters that don't come to help them. They're very uncoordinated and very undisciplined. They are not going to be able to fight well in winter. They're not trained. They don't have warm clothing, but the Ukrainians do. These are people who in peacetime have lots of warm clothing. They come from Siberia, but they're sent to the front lines in Ukraine, and they're not given warm military clothing, and their wives try to send them warm clothing from home, and they're told they can't, and they're dying of hypothermia. It's really, really difficult to understand why Russia is doing this. And the most sensible thing Russia can do is just to withdraw from Ukraine straight away. The more he fights, the weaker Russia gets. He's losing his best generals, he's losing his best officers, he loses officers just about every day. There's a site that keeps track of the obituaries of Russian officers, and every day they have new obituaries of new Russian officers that have been lost in the Ukraine war. And that's one of the Twitter feeds I follow. And they've lost many of their best pilots and their best people who operate their missile systems and everything. So the more the Ukraine war continues, the more Russia is unable to defend against anyone. And so if he was to use nukes, I mean, within a few, and so the US plans for what to do if it's funny. This blog post seems to work pretty well back to front. I'm working from the back to the front. I should copy the whole thing over, starting at the end and going back to the front. Seems to work pretty well. Anyway, this is how US would respond. It would blunt any attack with nukes. It would, if Putin used the nukes against the United States, it would disperse and respond with a wide range of conventional and unconventional non-nuclear methods to stop Russia from firing nukes at them. So they would stop as many of the nukes, of course, that they could that were flying through. If it was a small attack, they would shoot down 2/3 of them. They would blunt. They would then use special ops behind the front line. They would probably have sleeper agents, Russians who don't want a nuclear war and would stop it from their side, would stop nukes if they're doing a first strike. And there would be the generals would be talking against Putin, as I said. And they would also have these conventional weapons, and I talk a bit about that up here somewhere. The global strike capability. And this is something that so I'm going to talk about Putin's speech in a minute, but so just explain about the global strike capability. I think I talk somewhere here about that and granite. I could search this page for granite and find about I've got a little thing to. Is this searching? It should be. Oh, I'm using the wrong keyboard, I think. That's the right one. I can't seem. I've got several keyboards. I seem to be using the wrong one. I'm not sure what's happening here. Oh, this is the correct keyboard. So I'm on the wrong. I think I'm on the wrong page, and it's just not doing my thing. No, it should be doing that. It's doing something. Yes, here we are. Yes, here we are. So the United States are developing this prompt global strike capability. They tested just an ICBM, but without nukes on. They fired into granite, and it went 30 feet, which is like if you divide, that's about 5 stories, I think. No, 8 feet maybe is more like a story. So 4 stories. That's like a 4-story high house, but solid granite, and it can just go straight through that. So it could go through many even quite medium hardened targets, and it could just hit it without using nukes, just a conventional weapon. That goes way beyond normal conventional weapons capabilities. So the United States are putting these onto their it's for the future. It's not they don't yet have that, but they will be able to hit anywhere in the world with these conventional prompts, global strike things. So this is something that they have for the future. So right now their plan is that if Ukraine attacks Russia, if Russia were to attack NATO, then they would absorb any first strike, they would ride it out, and they'd blunt it. They'd use secret capabilities they haven't disclosed, and they probably include cyber attacks, and they probably include secret ops behind the front line, and they have intelligence. They're very knowledgeable. They may be able to stop Putin from even sending commands to and do it in a way that doesn't mean that they're going to use nukes. And anyway, they have secret capabilities to stop the nukes, and then they have secret capabilities to, and then they're going to, and then they would do a conventional. They would surely do a conventional take over the Russian airspace. The Russia couldn't do anything if they sent some F-36 and just decided, well, we're just going to take over the entire Russian airspace. And if Russia has started using nukes, it's no longer got a deterrent. It's got a deterrent to stop NATO doing that now. But deterrent is not deterrent if it's used. If you start using nukes, obviously the other side's aim then is to stop the nukes. So they are then going to be attacking you, and so they take over Russian airspace straight away, within hours to a day or something. They'd be attacking targets on the ground. They'd be sending in their Abrams tanks. There'd be nothing Russia could do, and Russia would just lose. And it might be the end of Russia as an independent country caused by their nuclear war, their attempt at a nuclear war. He's not going to do this. So now let's just look at these speeches that have been scaring people, that are just completely falsely reported. So I'll start with Stoltenberg. Now this is not Putin, this is Stoltenberg. He's misquoted and he's been misquoted before. He always says the same thing. He says there's a risk of major war with Russia, but it's not going to happen so long as NATO stays together. And that's what he says. And he said he is confident that we will avoid a major war with Russia. And he said that yet again, and this is the New York Times headline. NATO's Secretary General warns that a full-blown war with Russia is a real possibility. But they left out the bit where he said, I fear that the war in Ukraine will get out of control and spread into a major war between NATO and Russia, but I am confident that we will avoid that. And he points to the fact that NATO has increased its presence, and he says that NATO's most important task is to prevent a full-scale war, and not least, where did he say the bit? There's no room for Putin to doubt NATO's ability to defend. He knows, and he just knows that he knows this is happening. Where does he say? I'm confident we'll avoid that, and he explains. And NATO has underestimated our ability to protect and defend each other. and as long as we do that, we are safe. That's what he says. Putin has underestimated our ability to protect and defend each other, and as long as we do that, we are safe. So if we stay together in NATO, which we are doing, and we come together in a huge way with this, then we are safe, and Russia is not going to attack us. So they should have said, as long as we stay together, we are safe. NATO's Secretary General says that as long as we stay together in NATO, we are safe from a war with Russia. That would be an accurate summary of what he said. And instead, New York Times says that he warns that a full-blown war with Russia is a real possibility. So this is clickbait journalism. And if you go and click through the article, I could pick up the article, and it never says this bit. This is New York Times. Warns that if things go wrong, it could go horribly wrong. There's no doubt that it's a real possibility. We have to pay a much higher price if they're threatened to him winning in Ukraine. And I need to kind of say whether they should. So there's nothing. He doesn't say that. You see that there's just nowhere in the page. He never says this bit. He just left out this bit. As long as we do that, we're safe. It's not in that page. I'm a fast reader. You can read that. You can click through and read that slowly. It's not in that page. But well, let's just look. Since you can't read it, probably haven't read it in the time it took me to read it. Let's just check. The word safe isn't in the page. It doesn't say that we're safe. That quote isn't there. I just checked it. And you can click through and check it and see for yourself that it's not there. So Putin didn't. So that is just clickbait and it's false. And then here's another one that Putin's. This is a transcript of Putin's speeches, and the first one he said that he first of all said that the threat is growing, to be honest, but Putin's actions don't match those words. If he really thought Russia risked a world war, he wouldn't have used his military strength to try to invade Ukraine, and he wouldn't have used it up. He wouldn't have kept it going. He wouldn't have continued sending his soldiers in. He wouldn't have lost half his tanks for his First Guards Tanks Army and most of the defences in the Baltic regions. He hasn't just sent them to Ukraine, he's lost them in Ukraine. He's only got 6,000 soldiers left. He will have to try and reinforce those with untrained recruits. It's going to take years, decade probably, before Russia is back to the capability to defend itself it had on the 24th of February. Once the war is over, Russia will have no shells left, so it can't do another invasion like this. It can't do this war again. It's already used up its smart weapons and it's used up its shells. It wouldn't be able to start this war again on 24th of February with what it's got now. It would run out pretty quickly. So, and it's lost its best generals, some of its best generals, it's lost many of its best officers, many of its pilots. It's not. It's just a shadow. And the United Kingdom Defence Ministry says that just that one battle in Izium has lost a great deal of Russia's capability to defend itself against NATO, and it's not going to be able to recover from that. Just from that one battle in Izium, when it lost half the tanks of its First Guards tank army, and it lost much of its capability to defend against NATO in just that one battle. And just because the people in Bakhmut, which were attacking Bakhmut and didn't do anything to help their First Guards tanks army, which was losing all its tanks in Izium, half its tanks in Izium. And that alone is going to take years for Russia to recover from that. So anyway, he gives this, what he says in this transcript, he says that the threat is growing, which it isn't. He says that they're never going to use them first. Well, that's just Russian doctrine. He claims that it will not be the second to use because its nukes will be destroyed by NATO. Now, most of them would be destroyed, but some of them wouldn't. So that is just exaggeration. They would still have a deterrent if they would still have a small deterrent. But he says they're not going to use them first. He says it's not going to be second. So NATO is not going to attack Russia. NATO has no plans to attack Russia. Ukraine was never a threat to Russia, as I explained. And he's just giving standard doctrine. It's a deterrent and it's not going to be used. So that scared people because Putin said he's not going to use nukes. And they all said to me, comments on this blog post, well, Putin said he's not going to use nukes, so that means he is going to, because he always lies. He's not an opposite man, nobody is. He was just telling the truth there. He sometimes says things that are true. And this is true because you shouldn't say that because Putin says he's not going to use nukes that he is. He's not going to use them because he would be crazy to use them. And then the second one, he says that the US has a theory of a preventative strike, and he doesn't explain that this preventive strike is conventional, and that's what I was just talking about. They have this prompt global strike capability, which is to fire ballistic missiles, but this doesn't exist yet, but it's going to exist in the near future. They have a good conventional missile strike, but not this one that can go 30 feet into dark granite. They don't have that quite yet, but they will as this decade continues. In the next few years, they're going to have that capability. And Putin doesn't have that capability. He claims that he's thinking about developing that capability using nukes, but he doesn't really have that capability, and it's not credible. He's going to be able to develop it. And so he says Russia thinking about a disarming strike in a situation where their own security needs it, but he's talking about using nukes, whereas the NATO are talking about using conventional weapons, and he's just thinking about a preventive strike doctrine, but it wouldn't work if it's nukes, because a nukes isn't a preventive strike. Nukes is a nuclear war. So I think he's just bluffing there. He's not talking about something he's really considering. He's just using words again. He's trying to scare you with words, and so but the whole thing is premised around the idea that NATO is trying to attack Russia, which it isn't, and Putin knows that NATO is not trying to attack Russia. It's just his excuse for this war, and he's just saying it because that's his reason that he explains to his own people, and he has to keep saying that because it's the only reason he's given to his people as to why he says that he's denazifying Ukraine, and he said he's there to stop NATO from attacking Russia. And this war is going to end, and Putin is going to have to withdraw from Ukraine. It's not likely to mean the end of his regime. He's probably going to... Putin has such control of... If you see how good he is at speech, with the way he's managing to convince you and the Western media that he is able to escalate when he's in fact always backing down. He's lost over and over again. He's lost Snake Island, he's lost Moscow, there's the Kerch Bridge, there's the Saki Bridge, there's the Battle of Izium, the Battle of Lyman, there's the Kharkiv Oblast, the entire region lost in 3 days. There's the Kiev, the Battle of Kiev, when he lost that entire region in 3 days. There's the northern half of the Kherson Oblast. There's there's Kherson itself and the entire southern side he lost in a few days. And it seems pretty clear he's going to lose some more. There's going to be some more attacks over winter. It seems that they are going to do that at some point, though they haven't done that yet. So he's going to lose some other big area probably in a few days later on this winter. And all the time he somehow convinces the Western media that he never loses and that he always escalates. And that whenever he's attacked he escalates. And this is his power of words, of language. He is always backing down. He's always running away. And as he runs away, it's like Sir Robin in the Sir Lancelot and with the Monty Python and the Holy Grail, where there's Sir Robin who's said he's very, very brave, and he takes his minstrels along and they do a big song about how brave he is. And then as soon as he encounters his first obstacle, he runs away. And as he runs away, he bravely runs away, telling everyone how brave he is. And that's basically what Putin is like. If he's not going to, whenever he comes up against a determined and superior adversary, he just backs down and just goes away. And all the time, he not only says it, but he manages to convince the world that he is not running away and that he's escalating. And it's just extraordinary. That's his power of language. He's managed to convince you, he's managed to convince Western media that he's constantly escalating, even though he's lost all these big battles. And he's still losing. And he's going to lose again and again and again. And he's probably going to keep convincing them that he's winning until eventually he's forced out of Ukraine. So that's the only power he has. He trained in propaganda, he's from the KGB. He's got the power of language. He's using those power of language to try to get NATO to stop supporting Ukraine. He's using this power of language to convince the world that he is escalating, that he's going to win, to convince his own people he's going to win. Now, eventually, he's going to lose. When he does lose, he will use the same power of language to convince his own people that he went into Ukraine in order to denazify them, which of course it's not being run by Nazis. Zelensky's a Jew and he's got no connection with Nazis. His family were harmed by the Nazis. And there is a connection that the Ukrainians, way back at the time of the Nazis, early on, then some of them collaborated with them, not in the suppression of the Jews, though there was some connection with anti-Semitism, sadly, with those, but they used the Russian Nazi support to defend Ukraine against attack. And so these defenders have used Nazi symbols because this is part of the history of Ukraine, that they're not seen as being involved in anything to do with the things that were done against Jews. They are seen, this is Ukrainian defenders who were at one point working with the Nazis, but their job was, what they did was defend Ukraine against attacks. So there are these people in Ukraine today who use Nazi symbols, and these are the Azov battalion, who are very brave fighters, fight back against Russia in Mariupol, and they held back Mariupol for so long, even with very little by way of weapons, and nobody coming in to support them. And they have this association with the ancestors in the past. They're just their parents, grandparents' generation, who fought back against attack, and they had some help with the Nazis before, so early on, and that's the connection there, and that's why Putin is talking about denazifying Ukraine. But these aren't Nazis. They're not trying to attack Jews. They are doing it with the leader of their country is a Jew, after all. And they just have these heroes that have this connection in the past, but who didn't think of themselves in that way either, and they just have a very different history in Ukraine about what happened during the war. They see things from a slightly different angle that is difficult for people to understand who don't come from the country. But it's not about Nazism, it's about heroism against attack. That some of them use symbols that have also been used by the Nazis, and that is why Russia claims it is denazifying Ukraine. Anyway, Russia, but it's just it's an unofficial battalion, and some of them do have extremist views, but just like the United States, some people in the United States that have extremist views, so that those do also exist in Ukraine too, in every country. But that's not the Ukrainian government, and it's not in any. They haven't got any power, and it's even the Azov battalion. It's only a small fraction of them. The battalion itself is not in any way far right, and there's only one far right MP in the Russian government parliament. So it's not true what Putin is saying. They're actually even less than most than for instance Germany even. But what Putin would say to his own people, using his power of language, is okay. We felt we had to go into Ukraine. We had this we thought needed to be done. It's now been achieved. And we just tell them Ukraine has now been denazified, and we've now stopped. We've prevented NATO from attacking Russia, and NATO is not going to attack Russia anymore because of our brave fighters that have been fighting for so long, for so many months, and they managed to stop NATO from attacking Russia. That's what he tells his people, and they say, and it's now all over, and especially if we can come up with some treaty with NATO, he'd say, well, they're not going to attack Russia. They never were going to, but he claimed to his own people that that's what he's achieved as a result of the war. Because he lies and just makes up things with his words, and he says one thing when nothing is actually happening, and he's convinced you, so he convinced his own people because he's got complete control of the state media. So given how much he's just convinced you, if you're one of the people who's got scared and believed that he's capable of escalating against NATO, then just think how powerful he is with his own people when there's nobody else giving any other message, just his own word and nobody else's word. Then, so he can end this war at any time. And this is how the war is eventually going to end. And it seems likely he's going to have to lose Crimea as well. So he'll just say to his own people, and in order to defend you all against NATO, then we had to give up Crimea as well. So that's what he's going to have to say right at the end. Because it seems pretty clear he's going to lose Crimea now. And he'll just say to his own people that sadly we couldn't keep Crimea because our defense against NATO, but they were just too strong for us. And they've given Ukraine such powerful weapons, so we had to give up Ukraine, but we managed to prevent them from taking over Russia by the bravery of all our people. So that is how Putin would describe it to his ordinary people. Now, I just want to talk about our own attitude to all this. So don't feel that you yourself are in any way involved in this war. It's not going to attack you. He's not going to attack NATO if you're not in Ukraine, unless you're in Ukraine, in which case, of course, you are involved by being in Ukraine. But if you're not on the front line, you're not actively fighting. And if you're in Ukraine, then bear in mind that you do have the risk from these airborne missiles. But compared with traffic, the risk from traffic, and there are many Ukrainians still staying there, and roughly your risk is the same from traffic as from these airborne missiles that are attacking infrastructure. And of course, you take every precaution you can. You get in your shelters when you get the alert and everything, and you can greatly reduce your risk of being killed by the missiles. And if you're outside Ukraine, you don't have that risk. So you aren't in this war. You're not a belligerent. You're belligerent. Your country is not a belligerent. And as for supplying weapons, you don't have to buy weapons for Ukraine. You're not involved. If you're a pacifist and you want to help Ukraine, you can do as I did. I gave a donation for, I can't remember what it was now, I think it was medical support and things. You look for something that has nothing to do with military weapons in any way, that is official, and that helps the Ukrainian people. And so, for instance, in medical supplies or something like that, or housing the people who are displaced and things like that, then you can help them in that way. So think of it from that point of view. If you don't yourself want to be in any way involved in helping with there are people who do crowdfunding and things of military nature, but if you are not that way inclined, then but if you want to help, you can help in non-military ways, in just humanitarian ways. So you can help them humanitarian way if you want to, if you've got the money, but don't feel that you have to. That what this matters only if you feel you can do it, and it's easy for you to do. And another way you can help is by reassuring people who are scared and doing something about your fear yourself. And I mean, these media people who are doing all this scary, misreported articles, like in New York Times, they're doing Putin's work for them. And we, by helping people who are scared, we're helping those who we're helping undo Putin's work. So we're helping in that way. And so the most thing you can do to help Ukraine and help NATO and counteract Putin is just to counteract and help other people who are scared do what we're doing in the group. And that's a totally pacifist thing you can do to help Ukraine. So you don't need to don't think just because your government is helping Ukraine with its weapons, it doesn't mean that you yourself are belligerent in any way. And of course you can, if you are military. In my particular case, I am actually pacifist myself. If I was involved there, I would be involved as I always have been all my life, I think, as far as I've been a pacifist. If I was there and I was in Ukraine, I wouldn't volunteer as a fighter, but I could volunteer to help the injured in any way that I could, or to help in other ways, in other humanitarian ways. So my particular brand of pacifism is that I would be prepared to even join an army if my role was pacifist, such as the medical corps. And many Quakers did that. So I was originally influenced by the Quakers in my original pacifism and ideas about pacifism. Many of them had joined the medical corps in World War II. And so they were actually helping with the war, but as pacifists, not doing anything that would kill anyone, just helping save lives. So that's my attitude to all this. That I support in the way that I can as a pacifist. I support what NATO are doing in defending Ukraine, helping Ukraine defend against Russia, but I can't in any way suggest military strategy or in any way be involved as a fighter myself because of my pacifist beliefs. But it's not that I'm saying everyone in the world should be pacifist, I just am myself. I am as a Buddhist now. Originally I was pacifist anyway, but as a Buddhist, and it wasn't an easy thing for me to take as a vow, I took the vow of not killing, that I'm not going to kill any human being. And so that's the main thing about the vow, and do my best not to kill animals and insects and things as well, because Buddhists do that too as part of their vow. But the central part is the actual vow that would actually be destroying the vow of killing, and you've completely broken it as if you killed a human being. So I've taken that vow, so I can't become a fighter. But I can support them in other ways, and so long as, and I can't tell other people to kill anyone either. That would count just as much against my vow. But I can support them I support the whole thing in a general way. I just not as a fighter. So that's probably quite a good approach from mental peace point of view, mental health point of view, is just that you support in a general way what NATO are doing, but you don't need to think that in any way that you need to be involved in the fighting in any way from a mental point of view, unless that's something you want to do, unless you want to go off as a volunteer. Even being a volunteer in Ukraine, I follow someone on Twitter who's a volunteer in Ukraine, and he's an expert who's fought in Syria and he's fought against ISIS, and he fights against Ukraine I keep watching his dispatches. His ancestor a long time back, he fought in Crimea before, and he says he thinks he's going to fight in Crimea by the end of the year, and obviously very brave and experienced person. So if people who want to fight in Ukraine, then they need to be experienced soldiers. It's not something that you can do as not a soldier. So that's just something else. So I just want to say that as well. So some people fantasize about fighting in Ukraine, but you couldn't just as a video gamer and go. If you just fought a few wars in a video game or something, and then head off into Ukraine and expect to win to join the fight there, you'd be a liability to everyone there. So it's a thing for professionals. But the Ukrainians are very professional and they're expected to win. They're going to win. And the Ukrainians and the Russians are extremely unprofessional, and they're going to lose, and they've got much worse equipment. So at some point this entire war is going to end, and Putin, if he had any sense at all, so he's not insane, but he's not very sensible. He has what Putin is. He's sane. He's sensible about politics. He's got a strong power of word. He cares about his domestic audience especially, and internal politics in the Kremlin, and on that he's really excellent in the sense of being successful. But he is not useless at military strategy. He doesn't have the slightest clue, and it seems pretty clear he doesn't realise. If we just need to go on, put on Twitter, open source, the experts I follow, they don't hesitate about saying things that if Putin only knew that, then he'd give up the war straight away. But he just doesn't read them. He doesn't. There's plenty of material around that if he read it, he'd realise how bad a situation he is in. But he just trusts his people who tell him that everything is fine, and so believes the overconfident generals, and so that's why he's still fighting. The only reason. And eventually he's going to realise that they were all just not telling him the truth. And eventually he'll fire another general. He's fired several generals so far, but there can't be a general in this war except by lying to him. He's not going to accept a lie as a general who tells him the truth, not at this stage. And so that's basically the situation that we're in. And so there's did I say? No, I said that in the second one. Did I say in the second one? Just the last little bit at the end. This is Boris Johnson, former UK president. I'm not sure if I said it in this recording, that he just said that Russia's going to lose. Russia, by annexing those extra regions and everything, then there's just no way that Putin can be negotiated with anymore. And it can only end in one way. The only question is, there's no land for peace deal to be done. Nobody would trust him if he did that. If Putin said, give me this bit of land and we can all have peace, then Putin's not going to do that. Ukraine's just not going to trust him to do that, especially after Minsk and the way everything he's done. But he's not even offering it. And the only way can earn one way. So Boris Johnson, so he's got many other failings, but in the area of the military in Ukraine and Russia, and there is classic upbringing from the classics from the Greeks and the Romans seem to be standing him in good stead, unlike situations like modern diseases and so on. And so he said, just give Ukrainians everything they need: the unarmed vehicles to detect the launch sites of the drones and missiles, anti-aircraft missiles, the drones. He says that for and the same engine as the Vespa scooters, he says, he's got a good turn of the phrase for the languages, but that's for the Iranian drones. And a Spitfire would take them down, apparently, though we don't make Spitfires in the UK anymore. But we have plenty of planes, and he's saying that that they need the Attackams, they need the armoured tanks, cars and tanks, and he says that, surely goodness, after almost a year of this hideous conflict, we can see that this whole thing about risk of poking the Russian player is just total nonsense. And Mr. Putin knows he can't use nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. He knows the consequences. The truth is, he's the one who fears escalation. And it wasn't a threat from NATO that brought him in. It was decades of Russian Western attitude and irresolute resolution, and enticed him as a bully to just go in thinking he'd win very quickly. And before he entered Ukraine, I don't think I said that in this take. I've done a previous take of this recording, so that's why I got a bit confused. But before the war started, Putin said that he's not going to. Putin, I hope this take works. Quite long one anyway. We'll see. So, before the war started, Putin had the Minsk agreement. He had the Ukrainians attacking the Russian separatists back and forth along the contact line with very low-grade weapons, just shells back and forth, just occasionally from time to time. He had the Minsk agreement, which he almost held to. He could have brought that back in, and he just tore that all up. And he also, at that point, he had an offer from the United States to have an agreement that both sides don't have large-scale exercises near the border, and that they both remove nuclear weapons from near the border. The Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which Biden is keen to re-enter. Russia could have had all that, and it can still have all that, but they could have had that before the war started. So if he really cared about NATO, he would have signed that treaty. And he would have, before the war started, he wouldn't have had this war. There's no way that Ukraine firing a few shells across the border in Donbass was threatening Russia in any way whatsoever. And it's only because of the war that Finland has joined NATO. Finland particularly was resolutely neutral for decades. And then Putin goes in and invades Ukraine, and then Putin threatens Finland to attack them with vague threats of nukes if they don't join NATO. And this had the effect that Ukraine just immediately decided, okay, we're going to join NATO. So totally the opposite effect. They just don't like being threatened like that. And they weren't scared of him being attacked with nukes. It's just like, there's no way we're going to be associated with the country, we're just going to join NATO. And so that's the whole thing about the expansion of NATO is due to Putin. The recent expansion to Finland and Sweden, and Ukraine is absolutely pretty certain it's going to join NATO. If he'd never invaded Ukraine, he could have stopped Ukraine from joining NATO. That was in one of the things they were willing to agree back then. If he hadn't joined, if he hadn't attacked. So it's totally counter to this. And so the truth is, it's not a threat from NATO that provoked him to invade. It was just the apparent weakness of the West and of Ukraine, and just these rather feeble responses of Ukraine to the separatists. He sort of thought, if just the Ukrainians, the separatists, could just maintain this front line like that, and that's it. And that's it as far as Ukrainian aggression. Then the whole Russian army going straight in a big flood could just take over the country, especially since he thought it was being run by Nazis. And he just thought he thought he'd take over Kiev in a few days, and the Ukrainian generals would turn over to his side in order to fight the Nazis. So that's why he attacked, not because of fear of NATO, because he thought he could win so quickly. And then once stuck in, he just knew not backing down. He does back down, but he just just gives the impression of never backing down, and just that he still presumably thinks that he can win in Ukraine, and Ukraine has to persuade him that he can't, because he's so rubbish at strategy that he can't see for himself. So the only way you can see this, and because he's got all the generals who lied to him, so the only way you can see this is by Ukraine actually winning. And so that's how the war is going to end. And that seems pretty clear. All the experts, I say, they all say the same thing. He's not going to take Odessa, he's not going to take Kiev, he's not going to expand into Ukraine in any way whatsoever. He's not going to manage a status quo even, because he's constantly degraded. So long as they don't have a ceasefire, they say don't even consider a ceasefire, because that's only a way for Russia to dig in and immune from attack, and build up its stores and build up its techniques and rebuild all its bridges and its roads and its railways, and just get the entire front line of the occupied regions strongly fortified, making it much harder for Ukraine. That's the only reason he'd do a ceasefire at this stage. So, assuming that Ukraine continues going, which it is doing, then Russia is going to continue losing, and then that'll be the end of the war for Russia, and that's just as Boris Johnson says there, that's how the war is going to end. And Putin is going to continue bluffing as much as he can, even with the talk down by China. So we'll probably get occasional stories like this, and the clickbait media, they're not likely to stop. It's just grist for their mill. And the main thing we can do from our side is just not be scared by it all. And just reassure everyone, just spread the message that this is not anything to be scared of in any way whatsoever. It's just all politics, and it's all bluff, and it's all just Putin trying to scare people in order to influence our governments. So he's trying to scare the people through you to influence your government, and that's all there is. And then on his own side to seem strong to his own people, and that's all that there is in all of this. So I'll upload this, and hopefully it'll still help you, and you'll be much less scared by all this. And do share it with other people if you find it useful. And put the blog post in the video description for anyone, those two blog posts which this is about. So anyway, let's see how this turned out. I got a bit of a glitch, and I did a big long recording last time, and then I clicked stop recording and it didn't stop. It just got stuck. So I did a reboot of the operating system, and then it was all fine again. And so hopefully this is recorded correctly. We'll just see.